Equity oversight has always struggled with two big challenges. First, performance data is useless in identifying managers that are more likely to outperform in the future. It's actually even worse. Top decile managers in any one period are more likely to be in the bottom decile the next period than to remain in the top. Second, unintentional closet indexing is common. 1/3 of active equity funds and half of fund assets take too little security selection risk to ever overcome fees with skill. And most, if not all, of the largest fund of funds are also closet indexing. Here's why. For the average active equity fund, idiosyncratic security selection risk, what we pay active fees for, explains only 1/3 of the portfolio's tracking error. 2/3 is explained by passive market exposures. A market beta different than that of the benchmark, or sector size or value betas different from those of the benchmark, typically overwhelm any contribution from stock selection skill. That's the problem. For most active equity portfolios, more than half of incremental return is not due to the idiosyncratic performance of the particular stock selected, but to passive market exposures that are an unintended byproduct of the betas of those stocks. And these unintentional exposures can overwhelm any contribution from active skill. They also tend to mean revert, which is why selecting managers based on performance is a losing bet. But what's the alternative? We need to isolate stock selection return from market noise to detect a skill signal. And we need to isolate stock selection risk from passive market risk to detect and avoid closet indexing. Brinson attributions attempt the former, while active share attempts the latter. These were important steps in answering the two critical oversight questions, but unfortunately, they fall short because both methods assume that all stocks have market and sector betas equal to 1, when individual securities actually have very different betas. For example, Apple has a tech beta of 2.5, while IBM's is 0.2. So a 10% allocation to Apple equates to a 25% tech exposure, while the same allocation to IBM equates to a 2% exposure. It's easy to see why allocation is a bad proxy for exposure. Brinson attributions fail to predict future performance, and active share ends up missing over 80% of closet indexers. The solution is to first model individual security betas. Like the conventional Barra-type factor models, we model portfolio risk by first modeling individual security risk. But unlike the conventional models, we limit our factors to 10 independent, passively available ETFs. We estimate up to 10 betas monthly for over 100,000 securities using a stepwise regression of residuals. Sector beta is net of market, size beta is net of both market and sector, and so on. Portfolio and index betas at any point in time are then the market value weighted average of the individual security betas. Because each of our factors is available passively, we can now accurately separate the active and passive components of both historical performance and future tracking error. For the first time, we can detect statistical evidence of skill likely to persist and ensure we are taking sufficient active risk to overcome active fees. When security selection return is properly isolated from market noise, performance is, for the first time, predictive. We find that funds with security selection information ratios in the top decile are twice as likely to outperform over the following 3 years, and funds in the bottom decile are more than twice as likely to continue to underperform. Fidelity's Contra Fund mirrors the risk profile of the median active equity fund. Contra Fund's future tracking error will be 5%. 2/3 of that will be due to passive market exposures that are different from its benchmark. These passive risk exposures are very likely unintentional and will certainly overwhelm any contribution from security selection skill. Contra Fund is, however, taking sufficient security selection risk at 2.9% to overcome fees if they have selection skill. We can see in advance each of the passive market exposures that explain the passive component of future tracking error. Here, as typical, only 3 exposures explain over 75% of the passive component of tracking error. Contrafund is short tech and market exposure, and long the financial sector. We can also see in advance the individual security exposures that will explain the stock selection component of future tracking error. In this case, only 5 securities of the 275 holdings explain almost 90% of the idiosyncratic stock selection portion of tracking error. Pretty amazing. And as here, stocks not held are often the biggest contributors to tracking error. Tesla is not in the portfolio and Apple is underweighted. So when interviewing a manager, you will almost certainly know more about the drivers of the portfolio's future performance than the portfolio manager does. So here we are, a small firm you've not heard of, arguing for a new approach to oversight. One nice thing about risk models, though, is that their accuracy is easily proven in advance. Risk models, and models in general, are only valid to the extent they're predictive. The better current predictions conform to future observations, the more accurate the model. Our tests show that our models are every bit as accurate as the conventional, unhelpful for oversight Barra-type models, but it's easy to test for yourself. We're happy to provide passive replicating portfolios for your chosen funds, and you can compare predicted returns with future realized returns. So, some of the key benefits. First, we found that funds with top decile security selection skill are twice as likely to outperform over the subsequent 3 years. And funds in the bottom skill decile are more than twice as likely to continue to underperform. So for the first time, we have strong quantitative support for selecting managers as well as for when to replace them. But it's not enough to hire managers with security selection skill. They must also take sufficient security selection risk to overcome active fees. We found that 1/3 of active equity funds and half of fund assets take too little active risk to ever overcome a 100 basis point fee, even with top decile skill. While avoiding funds that are closet indexing is important, it's critically important to avoid inadvertently closet indexing the aggregate portfolio. And that's a much bigger problem than we thought. For example, most, if not all, of the large fund of funds are closet index funds charging active fees. Unintended passive exposures in the aggregate portfolio are easily offset in combination with complementary funds or with a small allocation to ETFs, reducing tracking error while retaining or increasing security selection risk. And you can imagine how much more meaningful client and manager meetings are when you know exactly which exposures determined past performance and which will determine future performance.